In this screencast lecture, I'll briefly describe some of the basic rules governing contract interpretation. These doctrines, and the concerns that animate them, relate quite closely to the parole evidence rule that we've just studied. Traditionally, courts took a formalist approach to contract interpretation that focused on the plain meaning of the written terms. Judges would look first to the ordinary dictionary definition of those terms. If the plain meaning of a disputed term was unambiguous, then no contextual evidence would be admissible to show that the parties might have meant something else when they used the word. For example, imagine that two commercial parties made a contract to buy and sell frozen chickens of a particular weight. A dispute arises when the seller delivers older stewing chickens, while the buyer contends the contract was for younger and more expensive broiling or frying chickens. Under a plain meaning approach, a court asks whether the word chicken encompasses both old and young chickens. If so, then the seller can elect which type to supply in fulfillment of the contract. Suppose instead that the plain meaning is ambiguous. The word chicken sometimes means only young chickens, but it can also be used to include both old and young ones. In this case, the plain meaning approach would allow parties to offer contextual evidence to prove which of these two meanings they intended. Notice that the threshold question of ambiguity is a lot like the traditional four corners approach to integration. Just as four corners supposedly looks to the text alone to decide whether the written contract appears complete on its face, plain meaning rejects contextual evidence unless the contract language itself is open to multiple meanings in common usage. Most courts no longer require a finding of ambiguity before they'll consider contextual evidence for interpreting contract terms. Instead, they move directly to the second part of the inquiry. They ask whether the proffered interpretation is consistent with the writing. We can best understand consistency as imposing a requirement that the contract language must be reasonably susceptible to the proposed interpretation. Notice again the close parallel to the parole evidence rule. Hunt Foods holds that additional terms are consistent only if they are in reasonable harmony with the writing. Here the issue is whether the proffered interpretation is consistent with the writing. Is the language reasonably susceptible to the proposed interpretation? That's like the reasonable harmony approach of Snyder. Once again, we see that these doctrines are driven by a tension between text and context. Courts must choose between a possibly quixotic quest for true meaning and a comparatively formalistic reliance on plain meaning. As with the parole evidence rule, the Code adopts a strongly contextualist approach. There's no requirement of ambiguity, and UCC Section 2202A invites courts to use course of performance, course of dealing, and usage of trade evidence. For what it's worth, there's some evidence that commercial parties often contract explicitly for more formalistic approaches. They use merger clauses to exclude parole evidence. And they contract expressly for plain meaning interpretation, to curtail the use of contextual evidence to interpret contract terms. Finally, they use commercial arbitration to draw on industry experts and simpler procedures. A neo-formalist backlash in the academy has criticized the permissiveness of decisions like Hunt Foods. And we see judges in cases like Snyder rejecting the most permissive approach and expressing a desire to protect written contracts from attack. These developments are some evidence that the trend towards contextualism has halted, or even reversed a bit. Thanks for listening.